Right. Hi, everyone. My name is Mimi Lam, she, her, hers. I'm currently living in Brooklyn, New York, also known as Land of Canarsie and Mansi Lenape. I am the facilitator for this conversation about violence in comedy, specifically with women of color. I'm working with the Blueprint Artist, which is a network of artists who create space. We train, and we're by BIPOC artists for BIPOC artists, and we're in collaboration with Black Girls Love the BARD, which is an organization that reimagines, re-examines Shakespeare through the lens of BIPOC women. And I'm going to let our guests introduce themselves with their names, pronouns, land acknowledgement, and a brief introduction. So we can start with Korinn.
Yes, I don't mind going first. My name is Korinn Annette Jeffries. I am a creator, curator, and analyst of Black theater. I am currently located in Greensboro, North Carolina, which is the land of the Tutelo, Saponi, and Shakori peoples. That's me. I am the dramaturg for Comedy of Errors. Yes.
Hi, I'm Raelle Myrick-Hodges. I'm the stage director for Comedy of Arrows, produced by Black Girls Love the Bard. And I am in Lenape, Canarsie, Flatbush territory out here in Brooklyn. And I've been directing for 3 decades in theater. And my pronouns are she and they.
Peace, it's nice to be here with you all. My name is Teniece Divya Johnson. I'm a movement storyteller, stunt performer, intimacy coordinator, consent, boundary, and empathy advocate. I'm in LA and New York, and I'm here by way of Freedom Summer 2020 and too many ancestors taken too soon.
All right, thank you so much. I'm pretty excited about this conversation with Comedy of Errors, particularly because it's a cast full of BIPOC women. And let's dive into some text because I feel like we have a lot to talk about, particularly with this topic, violence in comedy. So I'm gonna pull out a quote from Comedy of Errors and then ask y'all some questions. So in Act 2, Scene 1, Dromio, Dromio says, "And he will bless that cross with another strike. Between you two, I will have a holy head," which kind of suggests a sort of crucifixion and kind of a negative light towards the master's beating. So I wanted to ask, like, how does this message of injustice of slavery differ between Shakespeare's time and now? Because it seems like Dromio is giving a negative like connotation towards like the meeting that he's like taking.
I don't think that the connotation has changed much. I think that it's like always been a negative thing. I think in the case of Shakespeare, I definitely think that it's made light because of who's writing it and who is performing it. But I don't think that the weight of it was any different for the people who were not in control of the situation. I think that it was still the same.
Mm.
It's interesting when you look at it from a theatrical, like a text-based space. And what I mean by that is that violence is violence is violence, just like love is love is love, right? But there's the thing that slapstick is a real thing and is funny, right? So the question isn't, because there are plenty of works that are made by BIPOC artists, particularly in film, that are incredibly violent where people find it funny. So the question to me is the pain of the servant and the slave, it's what our connotations culturally become, right? Because master and servant is something that almost every country has had to deal with, no matter what their background or ethnicity. And I find that violence has also, from the artist perspective, apologies for being so long-winded, but from the artist perspective, is the place to alleviate it and to try to challenge the space of understanding it, which I think is different from the philosophical and socio-political issues that we have with viewing violence in context now.
And I think I have a bit of a different view on slapstick. I just feel like it's unnecessary because whenever you're hitting someone, you're invading someone's personal space. And I think that crossing that boundary, even in the theater, it can be uncomfortable for actors, it can be uncomfortable for viewers. I think I definitely can acknowledge that it's a thing and that people do it, but I just don't think that they should. I just don't think that it's right to invade people's space like that. Like, yeah.
Yeah.
Isn't it interesting? Or rather, is there a way that we can talk about boundaries with cast members before and work out a way to tell this story in a way that supports the director's vision and doesn't make the performer feel uncomfortable?
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask Teniece, well, how would you approach actors with something like this in terms of physical comedy? Like how would you approach them with that sort of material?
Well, I definitely check in with the director and the dramaturg to check in to see what kind of world we're living in and what's the kind of experience we want the audience to have. And then from that, kind of working backwards and checking in with actors, seeing where they're comfortable being touched on their body, where they're not. The whole goal being that we want to tell dangerous stories for our characters, but we never want actors on stage being surprised or feeling uncomfortable. So I can't say that I would come to the situation with choreography in my mind to put on bodies. It would more be discovering what's needed in the space. How can we connect with one another? And it's interesting too, when I was thinking about slapstick, I'm like, I guess there are opportunities where you can make physical contact, but how is it funny when, I don't know, someone goes to swing and maybe you tie your shoe and you're missed, and these constant near misses? What's a kind of story like that, which talks about what Korinn was talking about in terms of not wanting to see that or not wanting the audience to experience that. So I think there are many, many, many infinite ways as a creative team that we can come together and tell these stories that is in alignment with our values and our views and the vision we want to share.
Absolutely. And I think that one of the things I love about dramaturgy and intimacy directors, even in this format of Zoom, is that language can be violent in this space, right?
Yes.
So when I look at what we did with Comedy of Errors, before we even had it cast, Korinn and I and Roberta and Jamaica had a conversation about the violence in it, because safe space does not mean comfortable space. Growth can't happen in both places. So to me, artists shouldn't be limited. They shouldn't feel alienated from things that are really happening in the world and not depicting them, right? Because we can't go to the theater and never see anybody hit anybody and then watch the news, because then we'll feel like we're having dissociative disorder. However, when we started with Comedy of Errors and this was brought up as an issue, we started talking about culturally, what is it like for people of color? How are there possibly scenarios, particularly by serving this playwright, right? Because it's not my piece, it's their piece, right? So how do we serve this playwright and what they meant in this hierarchical space? So by choosing our theme, which was going around the idea of HBCU culture and Black sororities and fraternities, we then led into a conversation about sibling culture when you're not real family. And then what happens in legacies, because I didn't come from an HBCU, but this is how we resolved our violence issue, was what happens when your big sister is a Delta, you know, and the little sister pledges another sorority, right? So then what I did as a director is I took that space, having conversations, hopefully with Korinn, who I love is in this room and having these conversations with us. How does it feel as an audience when you feel it? So now when you have context of big sister, little sister, pledging, joyous Blackness where we tease and challenge because it's cultural and meant with love and indoctrinated that way, Romeo getting plucked in the head by their big cousin who's showing off is different from I enslaved you. Do you see what I mean? Mm-hmm. And so we were trying to serve the text and serve ourselves simultaneously, and understanding that as much as I want to say there's no violence and I don't want to be violent, Korinn, I have plucked my cousin CJ in the head before. Like totally just slapped him in the head. Like, why are you eating like with your mouth open? So I'm going to work on that for you, Korinn. I'm going to be gentler and kinder.
Yes. When you say pluck, do you mean mush? When you mush someone in the head?
Yeah, like pluck, like what? Stop. And that's that's how we're looking at, at least in comedy of errors, these moments. It would be one thing if it were different characters, but when you have characters that have grown up together, there's a space and a suspension of disbelief and safety that best friends fight. Best friends might have a screaming fight on the street in Brooklyn, and people will be like, oh, they're really good friends. It's fine. We can feel that some things explode, but that's not what this play is. I think there's a different conversation when you talk about Mackers, or you talk about Macbeth, or you talk about how Othello is treated and like objectified by the white court in the first scene. Then we're talking violence versus social conversation.
Yeah, Raelle, you mentioned that language can be violent, and Romeo calls himself an ass, and the word wench is thrown around too, and both of those words have like pretty significant historical context. Like the word ass, I believe, represents like a victim of physical abuse, a symbol of suffering, and it's pretty much the equivalent to a fool. So, and it even like has connections with women as bearers of sexual burdens and as prostitutes. So calling Romeo an ass kind of already gives the audience an emotional distance in a way. So how do you approach the text giving those connotations of that word, and what kind of maintains that suspension of disbelief?
I was gonna ask objectively what Korinn would think about that, but to me, I think that there's two things going on. I think I am looking at it from the being an artistic foreman and conduit and service to the playwright and narrative text-based work, right? So, for example, there's emotional violence to me in Fences because Troy decides to have an affair with a 17-year-old girl, and then Rose is raising this child forever. But we still say the story is about Troy. To me, that's a violent act. Believe it or not, to say that that is not Rose's story and that is Troy's story interests me. So to me, being in service to what Shakespeare was saying, not just historically, there is something to violent language that is true. And when those things are said, it becomes a reflection of those characters. And it goes back to what Teniece was saying about the idea of how do we have the character and the audience have this opportunity of experience without feeling violated, you know? And that is where I think we are in the field. So when I was talking about violent language, I was talking about how we interact as artists trying to make the work in that space, and how many mistakes can be made in just trying to articulate a moment, right? And things that can feel innocuous and flippant become insecurities for other artists in a room, or threats to an artist in a room, you know? And not knowing how to have those conversations, and whether it's language or physicality, it goes back again to what Teniece was saying, which is agreements. And that, just like we were talking about process, before I even started the vision, I asked Korinn, how do you feel about the play? I asked Jamaica, why did you want to do this play? You know? And then decided to be in service to the work, which is the presentation itself.
I would also like to add, I think when we talk about Shakespeare as the writer of this text, I believe that he meant everything that he said. And so when we talk about being in service to Shakespeare, even that makes me feel wary, because he says such horrible things about everyone. It's hard to want to, like, I don't know, trust his word as a playwright and bring, or even want to bring that to life and like really do him the justice that the work deserves, I think. I definitely have mixed feelings about Comedy of Errors. The more that I read it and the more research that I do on it, it's not for me as I thought it was.
But this is what I find interesting. That is the point of theater. A work, if we walked into every space that we went into and it was our cup of tea and we were in agreement, how do we grow? How do we get our own self-awareness? So I understand what you're saying when you talk about it from a research space. Understand, I personally am so grateful to be in this room because all of you are more informed and trained in a traditional space of understanding historically theater in that way. When I read Shakespeare, I'm not reading all the dramaturgical stuff unless it's coming from a face that's a reflection of mine, if that makes sense, right? Because that's a conversation that's about what's underneath. When I talk about being in service, I'm talking about in service of the production. The idea that there isn't archetypal and iconic ugliness and beauty within the text of his work would be unfair to say, as much as the work isn't that interesting. I appreciate just as much when my students are like, please don't make me ever read a Shakespeare. I'm like, here's 100 other plays. But as an educator, and particularly a person of color, we deserve to be able to imprint on this work, because how we are taking this Comedy of Errors and the conversations that's why we're recording our rehearsals. We get the chance to have a different conversation, and how it's breathing gets to be different. We are making more fun of what he's saying if it is true to him. I also don't believe philosophically that everything, and I'm not speaking for Shakespeare, maybe that's true for him, but if I felt like that about Shakespeare, I have to feel that way about Wilson, and I feel his work can be very sexist. If I feel that way about Wilson, then I have to feel that way about other artists, and it goes down the road. And so I like to take things moment to moment and be in service to that particular space. Because I think we're taking back Shakespeare by doing it.
I completely understand.
And cutting stuff out.
I was going to say, I completely understand like how helpful Shakespeare can be in process. I know like even in the discussion when we were talking about like the violence before, I know that as a consumer, it can be different as well. I think about like the comedy of the violence, particular the reference that I've seen most recently. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the show My Wife and Kids. There's the father of the show. He hits his son like upside the head. That's like a joke in every single episode. And it's like this canned laughter from the audience each time it happens. and it's supposed to be like really, really funny. And I know I watched it, I grew up watching it, and it was always funny to me. And then as an adult, I'm watching it and I'm like, I just would not hit my child like that. Like, I don't know that I could make my arms do that. And it just had a different feeling for me now. So even thinking about like Shakespeare in process and us having these discussions, I do think they're super, super helpful. But then when I think about it on stage, and I think about like children seeing that and even adults seeing that and thinking those behaviors are okay, that's when I start to have a little bit more of an issue with the text. Like, learning tool, phenomenal, but actual application, it's a bit more shaky for me.
Korinn, I think you bring up some really valid points here when we talk about agreements. It's also opening the doors for change. We can have one experience and we can change our mind. That's what consent is based on. It's reversible. And I kind of wonder when we go to this question of language in terms of like ass and wench, are we centering whiteness by denying ourselves the opportunity to be in these roles? Like, why wouldn't we have access to this? Why wouldn't we have access to see a power dynamic on stage?
I think there are so many other roles that we could be in. I don't think that we have to continue to uplift this white man and his plays. Like,
I'm not going to argue with that. I'm just saying, if we're here and we're talking about language, if we're talking about global majority persons engaging in this work, when we start taking things away like that, aren't we centering whiteness? Like, why can't I see a power dynamic? Or like you're talking about this sibling relationship, which is really interesting, because when we talk about intimacy, too often we think about romance or individuals we might have the opportunity to see naked. But intimacy is a form of familiarity or closeness. So as Raelle was talking about with establishing a sibling relationship, what is the physicality in there that can generate from love and power plays and joking? I'm with you on the plays in this Shakespeare. I feel you wholeheartedly. But I'm like, if we're here, can't we have it all?
Well, I think that form of intimacy is played out in terms of class and social status. Like, that's the physical violence is the only thing separating between Dromio and Antipholus. I think in Act 1, Scene 2, Dromio says, I have marks of yours upon my head, some of your mistress marks on my shoulders, but not 1,000 marks between you both. If I should pay those back, your worship, perhaps you will not bear them patiently. So at that point, Dromio is sort of talking back, and there's sort of this linguistic anarchy going on.
And I want to pull this back and ask the two people on the panel of color here, like what that means for an experience if we're denied these opportunities of language and centering of whiteness.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what I find interesting is, I think the beauty of being able, I try not to get verklempt at the beginning of every rehearsal when the screen pops up, because of the empowerment of having a company of artists of color who are female identified, who can kill on these 3-minute monologues. There is weight in that. And what I'm talking is empowerment. The best Lady Macbeth I ever saw, where I actually understood why she behaved the way she did, was when Angela Bassett did it. Unfortunately, her Macbeth wasn't as fantastic as she was, but I understood why she was doing what she was doing. I understood her drive. The idea, there's a philosophical place as to where we live in the world that I think can be an expression, not necessarily through Shakespeare necessarily, but something happens when it is imposed on a brown or Black body. And it does change, because the moment you're talking about Mimi, We just talked about that the other night because it's between Waikisha and Jessica in the show. And what happens is we discovered Romeo gets hit because Romeo talks shit, pardon my language. And what I mean by that is like, that's also a part of a community of like, I was raised with ain't nobody above an ass whooping kind of thing. Like, how long do you get to talk smack before you don't get smacked? And I don't mean it in a violent way. And it is violent, but I'm talking about status being shared. In our room, Dromio is bucking up through language versus like, oh, go ahead, hit me in the head again, blah, 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 blah. Go, go, go. Your wife does it too. You're both losers. And then walks out of the scene. So my question becomes, who's the winner in the scene? It's Dromio. It isn't Antipholus. Antipholus is sitting there acting like a jerk to their family, to their person, talking totally differently, and then turning around and looking like a total idiot in front of whatever merchant, whatever duke, whatever abscess. And they're all like, you're an idiot. They just sent you the gold. You sound crazy. So the person inflicting the violence in the show is the most foolish of the duo as well. And that is a part of what's written into the text, right? However, I'm not sure we would have found it if it were centered in whiteness, because the sense of privilege and assumption of things is different, where people of color have no choice but to communicate what they actually mean. So we get to spend a lot more time in these micro moments and each microaggression, because we as people of color do not want to be hit. So there better be a reason. So I end up being in service to the presentation because I have to have a reason versus a white director. They just think it's funny.
That really resonated with me when you were talking about seeing Angela Bassett in that role and feeling the story, seeing ourselves, having these experiences.
When I've seen that show probably 17 times in my life. She's the only woman of color I've ever seen in that role. Every prior moment, based off of the text, Korinn, based off of the history of this writer himself, all you see when you see a white vessel in that, self-absorbed, way too ambitious, all this stuff. When you saw Angela Bassett do that role, you saw a woman who came from nothing, who refused to have people take stuff from her. How dare you not crown him king after everything we have done for you? Yes, I will help you kill him. That's a totally different intention. And I'm not sure I could have even, it made you sympathize with the tragedy of the whole, not the tragedy of Macbeth himself. And it was the first time that epiphany of how great and strong she had to be his partner meant. And it wouldn't have happened had it not been in a brown vessel. And that's why I think things that can live on paper live differently when breathed, and why like there are certain companies we like and certain ones we don't take into account. So that's all I mean, because I completely agree with what Korinn is saying. I am new to Shakespeare. So for me, it's exciting to be a woman of color that's being given the opportunity to even delve into these types of questions, because I don't in white spaces, you know?
Yeah.
I would agree that it's interesting, like the difference between it being on paper and being performed. I don't think that we should deny ourselves the language, because I think the language is problematic and we should definitely be paying attention to it. I think we should like examine the language, because the language gets pretty bad in a lot of Shakespeare plays. But I can acknowledge, like, the first time I saw Shakespeare and was really into it, I got to see, I want to say it was the Classical Theater of Harlem. They did a performance of Romeo and Juliet at Duke, and it was mind-blowing to me. Like, they had guns, it was exciting. I had never been so into Shakespeare before. And then I asked for the complete works for Christmas that year and really tried to teach myself how to read it and failed miserably. But I just had a love for like the language. But then when I saw it on paper, and again, seeing some of the words that Shakespeare uses to describe people in sonnets, the way that he refers to ugliness in a lot of his plays, it just was a completely different experience for me than seeing this beautiful production that I had just seen, where I thought that, you know, Shakespeare was a place that I could be. And then I'm like reading the text and it's like, he's comparing my hair to these things. Like the color of my skin is an issue all of a sudden. Like it didn't register to me until I looked at the words on the paper. So I definitely can see how it could be different to view it versus like really sitting with the text.
Yeah. And so how do you think that the audience feels about Dromio? Like, obviously representation is important, and seeing a woman of color or an all woman of color cast for Comedy of Errors changes the BIPOC perspective in the audience. So how do you think we feel about Dromio from the audience?
I think we're really going to enjoy Dromio in this production. It sounds like, because as I said, when it's on paper, it does to me read a bit more docile. And so the fact that Raelle is finding reasons for the interaction to occur, as opposed to, so I'm sure, because are we familiar, the history of the play, why Shakespeare wrote this play, like for a Christmas gathering, like just for giggles. So knowing that too makes me take it a lot less serious, like in his writing, just that this is a throwaway piece that he did for fun, for Christmas, for everyone to giggle and drink their tea to. And so I do think that he did not himself give reasons to a lot of the things that are happening in the play. So I think with Raelle as our director for this piece, really finding those reasons are going to be so helpful in everyone's understanding of why things are the way they are in this piece.
Well, what's great is that kind of information is also the context for the company to be able to understand. We've talked about, like, out of many of his comedies, this one is ridiculous, and ridiculous because there's a lot of not good writing in it, right? The biggest issue I find when it comes to Shakespeare, addressing what Korinn was saying just a little bit prior, is we make it precious for no reason. We assume that this writer knew every answer to every part of the world, and that comes with the white supremacy of the assumption. But when you study Shakespeare, you realize half his ideas came from other people. You realize that this is a man who left his family to be famous. He's like the ad man on Mad Men. You know what I mean? So ultimately, taking him seriously at all is kind of ironic. Yet, if we didn't make him so precious, we could extract, like we would in any time space. It's 400 years old. Why aren't we just cutting him down? No one has 3 hours anyway, right? But we don't, because it's been put in this pedestal, precious white people. This is where you have to assimilate, and this is your goal of writing. And that is being dismantled. And I think that we're going to watch a change in what happens. And I just, as an artist in theater, want to make sure that acting artists and production artists of color who want to participate in that space get to. Now, with that said, the Dromios, our biggest concern was colorism. Like, we talk about status, we talk about hierarchy. We had a large conversation with our company around colorism. Because to me, that would have been just as frustrating to watch an Antipholus who's in power hitting a darker person coming from a family of a series of hues. And everyone, to be in a room where everyone was like, oh, yes, absolutely, and be able to just solve it versus like qualifying and justifying, which is what I'd have to do when you're casting based off of the assumption of who can do Shakespeare. And so having, first of all, our two Dromios are incredibly talented, like the rest of the company, but they are of a lighter hue and they have a sense of timing. And the foursome agreed, because I have them doubled, the four of them playing Antipholus and Dromio are of dark and light hue, and just the interspersing of power and allow that it's not this light-skinned person telling this darker person what to do. And that was really important to the company. And we do have people that are of color who are not of African descent, right? And so the beauty of being a person of color right now when it comes to dealing with these things has so much to do with the fact that we have no choice but to be informed with compassion and respect for people in a room. And so that's how we deal with our Joneos. Jessica and Jasmine are funny and obnoxious and make space for you to want to pluck them in the head. Like, be quiet. And I like it because that can be in service to the writer, but truly in service to the time. And that's what I think Shakespeare allows us to be challenged by. How do we allow that work to live now? Because there's some beautiful language.
Teniece, anything to add about the audience's perspective?
I don't have anything on that, but I thought it was really interesting, this idea of making Shakespeare's work precious, even the point that like sometimes people get affect on their voice. So I think it's really interesting and important that global majority persons has access to this work to explore it. And Raelle, I really like how you're talking about colorism, because when we're talking about power dynamics, how we appear matters. And it impacts the language, the character dynamics. So I'm just really excited to be here. Thank you so much for sharing your perspectives and your experience.
Yeah. Raelle, you mentioned you had initial conversations about how do we feel about the violence in the play and the question of colorism. Did those initial conversations about how you feel change when you started rehearsal and working with the actors?
No, Korinn is my conscience. So I just read the play and was like, ooh, how do I work in these boxes? And then Korinn was like, we have to talk about violence. We have to talk about colorism. We have to talk about status. And I'm like, So it's present because dramaturgs are important. It's present because we need people of color to be intimacy directors, to be dramaturgs, to be in these rooms with that type of information and gentility and articulation. So it changed because I hadn't thought about it, because I was indoctrinated like everyone else is as a theater artist. And if one is transparent, I was just excited that finally someone thought that maybe I could read English and do a Shakespeare play. And then Korinn reminded me thematically of my duty to the work. That's it.
Korinn, did you have any initial impressions about the violence in comedy? And have they changed over time?
Yeah, I just didn't like it, and no, I still don't like it. It's not for me. I understand that it's gonna be in some plays. I know as an actor, it makes me really uncomfortable, so I don't act anymore. And as a writer, I just try to evade it, which could be boring. I don't know. But I understand that there's a place for it. It has to be done. It's just not my cup of tea.
And Teniece, did you have any thoughts about or initial impressions about Comedy of Errors in particular and how you felt towards the violence?
I believe that Black people should have access to all things. So that we can have an opinion about it. So we can experience it and be like, this is for us or this is not for us.
And there's also, I feel, elements of make-believe in terms of slapstick comedy. So did you like incorporate some of that fantasy elements to the physical violence? And even over Zoom, I know there's already like a suspension of suspension of disbelief. So I was wondering if you incorporated anything else to make it even more
No,
magical.
because I really do respect, and it was a different way of looking at violence, hearing, because what I love about having a dramaturg like Korinn is it comes from the spirit and not from the intellect. She happens to be a genius, which is gross. But when you have someone in the room who you knows is an audience person all the time, the understanding of how violence can affect them changes that. So once I set this sibling culture, we're really keeping it there, because what I'm doing is I can't ignore it because so much language is around it, right? And it's actually where Dromio gets to defend themselves. Yet I understand her perspective enough to not have it linger as like the funny moment of the space. So for example, what Teniece was talking about, because we are dealing with a BIPOC community of artists that are national, one of our Lucianas is out of Vegas. That dialect is mad funny when she's like annoyed with Adriana. And one of our Antipholuses is out of North Carolina. And I don't know if you know how funny North Carolina is in, but y'all are mean all the time being nice, and it's hilarious. So it's just happening because we are not bound to old rules of what Shakespeare is supposed to be. So what's becoming funny in the scenes isn't that. That's just a moment in the moment of the status to be informed in the play. And that's what I'm trying to serve, right?
Mhm.
That's my hope. But also as a reading, it's difficult. Theater is meant to be in the room. And this communing, and had I been able to see Korinn every day, who knows like physically watch the body change, because that's what I do as a director, is sit and preview. I don't watch the show, I watch my audience. Like, can they receive it? What's not working for them? And not out of adjustment so that they feel super comfortable, but am I missing something? I've been living with the play every day. They're seeing it once. How is it? Cues of people to see what could happen. My question is how do we deal with plays of violence by artists of color that are contemporary plays that are popularized? Because for me, there have been some shows that have been celebrated over the past few years on Broadway that I've had issue with. And I'm curious about the violence in those and the curiosity around that. What was that play called? I always forget its name because it traumatized me so much. But it ends with like a Black woman getting slapped by her white husband and her saying thank you. Like I literally blacked out the title. And it was a great production, beautifully acted. Yes. And which I find quite ironic because if you read that play, it's viscerally more assaulting to me than a ton of Shakespeare plays, solely because at least Shakespeare was white and 400 years ago. This is, 2 seasons ago, from someone who's a reflection of me. So I'm curious about how you guys feel about that work when we talk about violence with our own communities.
I think that work is one of the ones that like really is why I think I'm such an advocate for the absence of violence, because I did not get to see that work, but I read it. And reading it, I know is much different than experiencing it in the theater, especially the way it was staged, with the audience being able to look at everybody else in the audience's reactions as this is happening, making it, to me, seems like it's amplifying a traumatic experience. And so I don't know, thinking about things like that, it just makes me again want to stay away from this idea of violence, because it's become this thing where it's like spectacle as well. And I think that it veers into a very dangerous area. again, it can be incredibly traumatizing, as I know it was for a lot of audience members.
I have a different relationship with the work, having worked on it at New York Theater Workshop and then on Broadway. The thing that was so appealing about this play to me is that Teniece character was allowed to say things aloud that I thought that I didn't know could be said out loud in front of an audience. And I do understand the complications of the work, absolutely, positively. And I also think it's important to have those experiences so that people can learn, take away what they want, and even if it's like, that's not for me. It was a really challenging and rewarding process to bring that story to the stage, to find the different ways that these characters can engage with one another on a specific level. If we're talking about understudies and different partnering as an intimacy director, it was really great to have the opportunity to figure out different boundaries for different characters, because you can't just have another player step in and do the same choreo. These are different bodies. We have different intentions. It feels differently in our skin. And I also think it's interesting this is hard because it's personal for me, and it was really hard to work so hard on a piece that we weren't treated kindly, and our performers really felt the backlash of that, and it was hard. It's really hard. I think the other thing too is, like, when we're talking about Black bodies and violence, to be specific, like, there's a whole world of kink in BDSM. Does that mean we don't have access to it because of our historical trauma? I'm not sure. And aren't there opportunities where we can ask, where we can be submissive, where we don't have to be taking control, where someone else, and there could be a catharsis in that? And I'm not sure if we're ready for that conversation, quite honestly. We might have a lot of other healing to do before we have access to that. I don't want to get off the rails here. It makes me
No, I want to hear what you have to say, because what's interesting is you didn't get to see the show, Korinn. Perfectly acted, perfectly directed, fully into it. What was interesting about that work, Teniece, is the impact of it because I'm a theater artist, I see what you see as well, right? It wasn't the play. It wasn't the end of that moment. The impact that you're hearing about was the moment I stood up on opening night at New York Theater Workshop, and every rich white man in there stared at my body and objectified me.
Yes.
And suddenly I felt extremely small because I did not realize that they did not see what I was seeing. They were not seeing that because there are no expressions of the super slews of Blackness that are feasible. So when I see that play, I walk up and that person is empowered to think of me more objectified, not less. And my question then for you, Korinn, becomes, does that have to be the job of an artist or not? Because that's what I've been grappling with when it comes to that. Having an affinity for working with half the company on other plays, like, I champion that work. And then I literally saw a man trying to look up my skirt and literally feeling like, if I act the way I want to act, being from DC, I'm doing exactly the stereotype that they would expect from my reaction, because I just saw a play that allowed that to feel a safe space for them and not for me. And I paid $35 too.
I hear that, and
the work was brilliant. And that's my question.
It's such a different experience when it was an all Black audience versus there were times where white audiences were laughing and I was filled with ire. So I feel you. Korinn, what were you gonna say?
I was trying to say, I do feel like for me, when I'm working as a playwright, it is my responsibility as an artist to make sure that my Black audience members feel safe and protected, as well as my company. So I do take that into consideration when I think about the topics I write about, and I think about the venues that I decide to have my plays in. So I do take that as my responsibility as an artist. I know that not everyone does, because a lot of people are focused on production and sometimes end up sacrificing things so that they have the production of their dreams. I do know that something that I was concerned about also was the care that was taken for the actors in that process. And I heard about some things that had happened. I know that that was a very hard time. And I just wondered, like, about the artist who was putting these people in this dangerous situation, and if that had been something that was considered beforehand, that these would still be old rich white people coming to these shows. That, I mean, I know that there were Black theater nights, but I don't think that that's attainable every night on Broadway. And as you all both stated, it does change the experience of the show as an audience member, who you're experiencing it with, because theater is a communal experience. So I don't know. I feel like it's my responsibility, but I think that that's just something that people have to make the decision for themselves, because it is a lot of sacrificing that comes with it.
I think it's so hard, the challenge that is put on global majority artists. It's like, in addition to poking holes and asking questions and exploring topics, we then have to anticipate how it'll be received. It just seems so much sometimes. Not to say that it's not important, but it's like, how are we going to keep delving into topics or like peeling back layers if we're like, oh, they can see us? I don't.
White artists never have to take that into consideration. And I think that that's why, I mean, because let's be super clear, what I do also want to say about that work is that whether someone in the Black community agreed or not, the importance of Mr. O'Harris being able to have that work presented on Broadway along with the other two works that he's presented is imperative, which is why these conversations are solely happening in BIPOC space and not in a mainstream space, because all the colored folks I know are like, I'm not trying to have this conversation and have them think they're winning something over us. This is still a conversation for us. And I think that's about the growth of an artist. When you were talking about your responsibility as an artist, I think what you have to take into account is very few venues of color, including the one that is getting to present Comedy of Errors, gets the resources and opportunities that even the same size, predominantly white space would get. And thus, what ends up happening is that artists of color, no matter what hue or reflection, whether it's your cup of tea or not, are being pushed into spaces where, yeah, they want to see their piece realized, but they should not have to also know how it's being marketed because they're writing the play. And yet you can go to the infrastructure of those spaces and know that those were going to be problems, right? As an artist. And so it's a double-edged sword. And so my heart goes out to all of us as artists that are trying to make work. I feel that way every day. Like it's frustrating that I love horror movies. Does that make, right? Like, and there's tons of violence. I love a good haunted story. I love that stuff. Does that make me less of something or more of something within my community? Or do we, as Teniece has been saying, which I think is important, whether it's comedy, violence, sex, humor, like all the things that anyone else gets to ask for, can we also ask for? You know?
I think it's just difficult because I do agree that we should have all the things that everyone else has, but there's a lot of bad things that other people have. And I don't necessarily think that we should do it just because they do it if it's like bad, you know, just because I think about, like, I don't know, there's just a lot of things that could be really bad. And it's like we as Black people or people of color feel like, oh, we should do it too. But it's a bad thing. It's still bad no matter who does it, you know? I don't know. Or like morally bad, not necessarily like bad. And not to say that horror or anything like that, because I too love horror films, which is so funny, right? Because I don't like violence. But I don't, I could do horror films, I guess, because I'm a bit more detached from, I guess, whatever's going on. It's not as personal as, I guess, the violence that we see on stage or in like familial relationships and that sort of thing looks. But yes, I definitely agree that we should have opportunities to do all the things, but I just wonder, like, when.
Yeah, and I just want to take one note of what you said, and I respect it. Okay, so understand, I respect your point of view on this when it comes to the idea of values and morals and mores. However, the artist's job is to challenge those things, period. And if you're not uncomfortable with some of the work, if you don't want to protest something, like without slave play, I wouldn't have even known that that's how I felt after a play. It wasn't the play, it was the audience, like Teniece was saying, right? But I do believe we have to, whether it be violence and or sex, putting the instruments in place that allow for safe space and agreements to allow individual artists, no matter what their background, to choose to participate, to change casting from here are just the 2 pages of a play and then you get cast and then you find out you might get raped in the play, actually having them read the play before they have to audition so that an acting artist isn't put in the position of saying no and then being told they're being difficult and then can't get another job. Like, the types of violence that are happening within the process, to me, worry me way more than the products, because we have a ton of stuff that can get pushed out there, but the process of what's happening to artists who aren't able to heal in these spaces and understand context is my biggest concern. And that's why I love having you as a dramaturg, because you make sure that the piece that you're working on is in service to the values that you have, and you make us all have a reflection of that, whether we all agree or not. And that is supposed to be what theater does.
Is there anything that BIPOC artists can do? Because I know a lot of them are creating their own work because they don't feel comfortable in these large theater institutions that where they feel oppressed. And is there anything that they can do? I mean, and like you said, Raelle, there are limited resources when through venues of color. So I was wondering, like, what else can we do?
I think, like you said, continuing to create our own work. And I think that we should stop relying on these large institutions to push our work. I think that we should put more emphasis on local theater and smaller scale productions that can travel and reach more people. I think that that makes theater more accessible and is just better for everyone in general.
I want to keep advocating that we get to occupy the spectrum of stories, that we are able to tell Black drama sans racial trauma, that we can talk about a dysfunctional family and the happenings there, that we can have the same opportunities that have been afforded to other people. I just want to keep telling stories that are about us, that don't have to deal with racial violence and what have you.
Yes, I want to tag on to what Teniece was saying. I think it's really important for us to be wary of making the choices for BIPOC artists of what they get to talk about. And what I mean by that is, it goes back to preciousness of Shakespeare. What was, like, again, it wasn't the play, even with the hit, like, because everybody who's Black, like you said, we're like, we feel it or not feel it if it's that community. But when you are isolated outside of that at a venue where you know you are already objectified from the moment you buy your ticket, the feeling is different, right? So training artists that are directors to understand that the job starts at the front door with your audience versus just like how cool your parlor trick is on stage. Like, ooh, we have fire, has a lot to do with it. But boring, only social justice plays. And I can't just do a play that's hella funny for no reason and dumb and stupid, or because dumb and stupid is as much of a release as a cathartic conversation in an intimate play about getting over a trauma. Theater needs the same type of variety, and it's not just background, it is aesthetic, it is philosophical. For example, we keep forgetting that people wanted to hate on Katori Hall for forever, from a decade ago, because she wrote The Mountaintop, and she expressed that Martin Luther King probably slept with someone other than his wife. And Black folks flipped out. You can't make it about that. And it's not only factually true, but the play is beautifully done because it's the night before he's shot, and he's visited by an angel that tells him to prepare for his death and what the world will be after he is gone and what his impact is. And yes, it starts with him hitting on her. But so many people missed that play the time it came out. She had to go to London to get it produced first for it to be taken seriously in the States. And then it went to Broadway. And then it becomes its own distorted thing, and that's subjective. But that to me was a perfect example of where we can also go the other way for a myriad of reasons.
So that makes me think, like, are we at our capacity for empathy for artists here? Or are we so hurt and seeking healing that we can't give that piece? Because here's the thing, art's not, you're not gonna like everything about it, but where do we stop our policing of artists? Because you mentioned before, like, artists are here to disturb the peace. That's what James Baldwin says. Like, when do we get that afforded that right? Are we out of empathy for that? Or is that something we have to ask for from our community and the support?
I don't think we're out of empathy for artists. I don't necessarily think that that means that we should always do work that is traumatizing. I agree that we should, again, do everything on the spectrum of things to create. Doing Shakespeare's work to me just isn't, I don't necessarily always think that it is the radical act that we think it is by putting our Black bodies in it. And I think, like, a lot of work is like that. Re-traumatizing an audience isn't necessarily the radical act we think it is either. I would say that, I don't know, something like Waiting for Godot, where we're walking around in circles for 5 hours, could be really powerful. And I don't know, I feel like that is also giving Black people the agency to do things outside of social justice stuff and trauma and all those things as well. I wonder, when does the artist also have empathy for their audiences and take into consideration how that they're going to feel doing something, as opposed to just using the art as therapy for themselves? That to me, I think, is also a question.
Those are good questions. One, I want to bring up Waiting for Godot because you use that as your innocuous one. By the way, Lucky's in chains when he drags himself across the stage in the monologue. He is enslaved. So that my point being is that Beckett to me is like the best at knocking these things out the box, right? That's a great playwright. And I do understand what you're saying, but I don't believe that BIPOC artists have had enough opportunities to make mistakes as individual artists to be policed yet. And as much as slave play really, it hurt my soul. I refuse to talk disparagingly publicly outside of a forum like this about this play, because white people don't get what I'm actually talking about. They think I'm talking about the moment on stage, and I'm talking about the moment off. And thus, the question becomes for the artist, how are they supposed to make the work on stage if the producers and us as the director and the dramaturg, and you're doing your job and I'm trying to do mine, and intimacy directors aren't in play? They are there to learn too. They are there to be enlightened too. I can write something about how much I hate my daddy all I want, but that doesn't mean he's a bad guy. But if every piece about a Black man says he's a horrible father, Do I have to be responsible to that if my father was a horrible father? That's the question I have when we get down to what an artist has to express. Because what's also happening is artists of color are going, ooh, I have to compliment and not compete. Ooh, I have to do this. Ooh, I literally am having a panic attack because I am making a piece about my dad, and it's a bunch of conversations about how much we love each other. He was a federal agent and thinks it's funny I'm an artist. And I'm like, ooh, does it have enough impact and trauma because of my vessel? And yes, have I been assaulted? Yes. Were my parents separate? Yes. And guess what? None of that made me sadder or uglier. Or I didn't even know they weren't married because my daddy wasn't absent. So I think that artists who are artists of Western European descent have had the millennia to feel liberated to then be accountable for their actions. I am literally just trying to make space for BIPOC artists to be able to make mistakes. And if the biggest mistake can win a Pulitzer and 3 Tonys, okay. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, because people keep forgetting, people had a problem with Top Dog Underdog. People had a problem with every play George C. Wolfe ever made. You know, people had a play with Federal Theater Project, that we as people of color are always going to be double criticized. And thus, as artists, I just want them to be liberated in the room with me as an artist. I just want that first.
That's beautiful. And one of the things I've had to take note of as I continue to learn more information or being an advocate, it's not policing. I don't want to live like that. I want to have the opportunity for things to exist, and maybe it's not for me. But Raelle, I like how you talked about like not talking disparagingly about things, because we have the opportunity, because we haven't had the opportunity to make messes. And a lot of times that's where growth and discovery can come from.
I would also just like to be clear that I'm not policing anything, but yeah. I am like, I do have very strong like opinions about stuff, which is, I mean, again, why I feel like we should be still seeing all of these things, because I am able to form these opinions based off of the things that I've seen and that I've read, and I wouldn't have these opinions without seeing and reading these things. I do, however, think that it's okay to talk disparagingly about some of these things because everyone has an opinion on these things. Again, if we're going to invite these things into existence, people have the right to talk disparagingly about it. I mean, I definitely agree it's the double criticism because you're concerned about your Black audience and your white audience. And I mean, it's the same thing that's been happening since the beginning of time, or since the again, realistically, like Du Bois said, you need both, you need it all. And people still took that and they were like, oh, he's advocating for one thing because he's criticizing and giving his opinion on everything. But yeah, I definitely think that, like everyone's saying, it should still happen. But it should also, people should expect criticism as well to everything, because that is the nature of putting something out there. Criticism is going to come. Both like positive and negative usually, so yeah.
So we're nearing the end of the time. Is there any like last words about the topic? And I know that this might never, like this topic will never end. Like we're always, I feel, going to have violence in theater or stories. So I wanted to ask any last thoughts that you have.
Come see it. Come see Comedy of Errors.
I just want to say thank you. It's an honor to be in a space and to have these conversations and different points of view for where everyone's coming from. And passionately, I think that's the dope thing about artists. So thank you for having me, and thank you for sharing your words.